Hello, I'm here to discuss the discourse that's gaining traction between Hispanics and Black Americans in their effort to disrupt the unjust treatment they are receiving by protesting. I will provide historical and practical context as to why Black Americans have distanced themselves from this phase of political resistance. Black Americans are visibly absent during this political exercise. At the core of our absence is our shared principle: do not invest more in others than they invest in themselves. Naturally, I am speaking of the outcome of the November 5th election, but it goes much deeper than that. I am not here to rub salt in already what has to be gaping wounds. However, I am here to point out how those outcomes have resulted in a huge breach of trust between Hispanic and Black Americans. This violation and breach of trust has forced Black Americans to reflect more intently on instances where we have been flagrantly betrayed. Black Americans, it's no secret, are constantly receiving the shorter end of the stick. For historical context, the Vietnam War. I recall when I was very young, my political science instructor, she captivated our attention as she recounted how the war was televised. She shared, had the war not been televised, many of us would have been left in the dark as to the casualties that were being reported up to the minute across national news networks. I clearly recall how passionately our instructor conveyed how they would rush home from school and plant themselves in front of the television as they would listen to the count of casualties amongst American soldiers and Vietnamese. Naturally, when the numbers of the perceived enemy's numbers of casualties exceeded that of American soldiers, there was a sense of cohesiveness, patriotism, and a sense of belonging. However, that sentiment began to change rather quickly as Black Americans became more aware of the statistical disconnect of casualties among Black American soldiers versus white American soldiers. In very simple terms, our instructor explained to us that if the population of Black Americans was 10% and the population of white Americans were 89%, when we would hear across the airwaves that today there were 5 Black American soldiers lost and 5 white American soldiers lost. So on the surface, it seemed like, oh, soldier for soldier. But that was not the case. She went on to explain, say for instance, if the Black population in 1955 was about 10% and the white population was about 89%, consider sending all 10 members of your Black family to war. And in the white community, send all 89 members of your white family to war. And in said war, black 5 Black people lost their lives, and 5 white people lost their lives. Something wasn't adding up. And what wasn't adding up was that Black lives were being lost in disproportionate numbers to white lives that were being lost on Vietnam soil, because it was determined that Black soldiers Although there were fewer in number serving in the war, they were being pushed to the front of the battle lines. And what does that have to do with what's going on today? And why Black Americans are not out protesting in the streets? On November 5th, we stood in line for hours. We missed work. Some of us missed pay. We stood in unfavorable weather conditions. I saw people out there standing with their children. Some of us donated financially out of our abundance, many of us out of our lack. We played by all the rules. When we went to the voting booth on November 5th, we willingly went on the front lines. Not only did we willingly go to the front lines, but we thought our Hispanic brothers and sisters were going side by side along with us on the battlefield, only to find out when the rubber met the road, there were more Black casualties on that field than Hispanics. And what was even more disturbing were the number of Hispanics we saw on social media, on various news outlets, conducting street interviews that were more than willing to throw their own brethren on the front line in the name of self-preservation. Knowing that Black Americans would not naively go out and protest shoulder to shoulder, only to find ourselves being pushed to the front of the battle lines. Now, I'm hearing a lot of, oh, Hispanics stood with you during Black Lives Matter. Hispanics stood with you during this protest and that protest. We are living in the age of media and technology. I have yet come across one stitch that confirms that. And if Hispanics were involved in those protests, those numbers were not enough to claim solidarity. I'll tell you what I did notice was the dilution of Black Lives Matter to All Lives Matter. Where was the support for Tamir Rice, Atiana Jefferson, Michael Brown, George Floyd, Sandra Bland, Sonia Massey, Breonna Taylor, Alton Sterling? Where was the support for Stephen Clark? Where was the support for Manuel Ellis, Andre Hill, Dante Wright? Where was the support for those people? I did not see the presence of Hispanic coalitions, grassroots advocacy groups. I didn't see that. And I'll just end with this observation. During these protests, I noticed that there are no dogs, no hoes, no excessive physical acts of aggression on behalf of law enforcement. I noticed that there are no shots being fired and certainly no loss of life. So, to be quite frank, I feel that this situation is just a keg waiting to be lit. And I think that Black presence on the streets, protesting, marching, will only be the catalyst to ignite it. For your safety as well as our own, we should not be there. We'll continue our financial protests and collectively apply pressure where it makes sense.